Nothing like some weeping and gnashing of teeth to get you ready for Thanksgiving this week. So we had a baptism this morning. That's why this is all still out. And the florist that we use, she just had extra, and she said, "Oh, I want to bring something beautiful to the church, and then also the Japanese ministry." So this was wonderful to have these as a gift for this baptism today. So obviously there's a lot that's going on in the church, and I'm not going to go through the laundry list except to say please pay attention to all the dates and save the dates. And there's a lot of, the next month will be a blur really. And if you're coming to our new member class, that's going to be in the hall after service today, and that's just for anyone who's interested or wanting to meet other new people in the church, but also say publicly, this is going to be my church. And you don't have to come to the class to say that, but it's a way to get more deeply connected to the church. The office will be closed this week for Thanksgiving. Susan's already gone, so staff people will be around, but don't come looking for Susan because she won't be here. And where she is, you won't find her unless you go far away. And also, too, like the Palmers, all their kids are here, so this is a time for families to be together. So, we'll be around, but we won't be around. But feel free to email or call, but this is also a time for families to be together. And we will have that for this week. But, we'll have our Bible studies and some of our other meetings already planned. All of those will happen. And the school already did their Thanksgiving dinner, so they're going to be closed this week. I think that's it. I felt like there was one other announcement, but it must not have been important. So we do want to, let's see, where is he? I saw him come in. Benjamin, there you are. Benjamin, will you just raise your hand? Benjamin just signed at GCU for volleyball, so congratulations, Benjamin, for that. That's an accomplishment. And we just met someone, it's his first time here, Danny, and he's going to Colorado, so it's last time. So Danny, we're going to pray for you. So even though he's only here once, we'll still invest, even if you're only here one time. Danny, you get a hand. Danny's leaving. Danny is leaving, and no, we want to pray for your safety and well-being. So I was invited by a father to walk the cemetery so he could show me where his grave was for his son this week. And we parked at Westminster Memorial, and we walked through the whole cemetery. And the entire time he was talking about his son who had died. And I've told you, this was a son who died of a fentanyl overdose. And we were walking to his grave, and the parents are divorced, and there's some acrimony there. But he said, at least we could come together on where to lay our son. And so we walked to the grave site where the funeral was, and he said, we chose this spot because there's the shade of a tree, there's a bench where we can sit, there's a fountain over there, and then he said, over there is a statue of the Virgin Mary. And he goes, but it's a spinning statue of the Virgin Mary. And I go, oh, a spinning statue? I haven't seen one of those. I'm like impressed, wow. He goes, well, it doesn't spin fast, so don't think she's like, the Blessed Mother is not just spinning like this, But, they said they can turn her for wherever the service is, and then you kind of have the Virgin Mary looking at your grief. So we had the service, and as you can imagine, it was a life that was cut short, and there were some other complications that he had had. But it was a beautiful day. It was a beautiful day for him to bury his son. And I went over to the funeral director, and I said, hey, I heard that the Virgin Mary spins. And they said, well, she used to. They said, but she's, the mechanism's broken, so now we have to spin her ourselves. But we can. If you need us to spin her, we can spin her, And I go, well, but they go, we do want to let you know there's another statue in the park of Jesus, and he spins on his own, like he's still working. And I go, okay. I said, this is, you really should be telling the community that you have these two spinning statues of the Holy Family. And, but I was thinking of that, because there was a portion where they were actually having people sign the casket of this young man as a final message of love. And so I was sitting and looking at Mary while they were doing that. And it was very much what we heard from Zephaniah this morning, when you have this feeling that sometimes it's your job to spin God. Well, we need God to pay attention to us. Come over here, someone spin the Lord, bring the Lord. We don't even think Jesus is automatic anymore. Spin Jesus, and this religious work is our work to do. And what it leads to is a kind of feeling of cynicism or even just indifference, where you're like, what really does it matter anymore? Like, what difference does it make? And you even heard that in Zephaniah. People go, God's not doing any good, God's not doing any evil. Really, we're kind of on our own, and God's not going to show up, and life just happens because that's just what happens, and religion's something that people created to feel better about a life that just happened. So spin the statue, and it'll make us feel better at least. Well, the surprising thing is the prophet Zephaniah, who's speaking about 600 years before Jesus is born. The prophet Zephaniah reminds the people that God actually is doing God's own spinning, and this time not the spinning of statues, the spinning of the world, and that what happens when God shows up. Now, I've been telling you about this because at the end of the church year, which is where we're at, really through the end of November, it's the end of the year, all these texts are always apocalyptic. So if you were listening, you might have been like, wow, wrath and this and that, and disappointment, and you're going to have a house, but you're not going to live in it. There's going to be this changing of fortune. And then the parable from Matthew today, very apocalyptic. And as a Christian, you need to have a responsible sense of apocalypticism. There's so much irresponsible apocalypticism, which is people get afraid, they start flipping out, then they kind of slip into religious conspiracies, and then all of a sudden they're like, have you heard about if you take these signs and hold them up? It's like very much the red strings and going like, look, see, I figured it out. But what it is an attempt to make sense of really a world that feels overwhelming. You just go, gosh, reality feels overwhelming. I need to try and put these pieces together to get a full picture. And you do need to be apocalyptic to the degree that God has promised a new beginning. So apocalypticism is important to Christianity. It's an apocalyptic religion, but it has to be done responsibly, and you cannot be a fearmonger. It would be very strange if God, whose constant message is, do not be afraid, said, well, actually, I want you to be afraid most of the time, except maybe once at Christmas and once at Easter, you don't have to be afraid. Otherwise, be terrified the rest of the time. That doesn't seem to be consistent with the message. But what are we to do with these texts that describe God showing up and God knocking on doors and God opening doors and God saying, I have a sacrifice. I'm inviting you to this feast. It's very much the parable that we had last week. God going through and inviting people, saying the time is now. And that language of wrath, which we should address, is simply to say that when love arrives, there are certain things that love doesn't abide. So when love shows up in Egypt, and Egypt's entire economy is based on exploitative slave labor, that can't exist anymore if love is going to create what love wants, which is the society of covenantal belonging. So love will exclude certain versions of reality, and to the degree that people are committed to those versions of reality, it will be painful. Because you go, you can't take that. That's the only way. Who's going to build the pyramids or whatever they were building? Who's going to do this? When we are limited by our violent imagination, we can't imagine that the kingdom God brings isn't going to have some remainder where someone isn't going to have to carry the bag at the end. Sorry, you're on the bottom, just the way it happened. Glad I'm not you. And that's one reason, and I was saying this at this funeral, it's one reason we become very uncomfortable with the grief of others, like in this case of an overdose, because we don't want it to happen to us. And if we can find some reason why it happened to other people, it will somehow give us the distance that will keep us safe from having to experience something terrible like that. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. So we have to sit in the discomfort of the reality where young men, in this case, can die after taking drugs, being poisoned by drugs, and that could happen to anyone, anywhere, because that's the world in which we live. And that's the world that love doesn't want to leave like this, with any loose ends, with people being crushed, with people being dehumanized. And so love is coming, and when we think that God is indifferent, that is a major mistake. That's why Zephaniah goes, oh, if you think God is indifferent, wait till God shows up and see what happens. Now, I told the first service because we had the baptism, I was going to preach shorter, but we don't have a baptism today, so it's going to go on for a while. All the things I didn't get to say to them. I will turn it to the parable because that's really just a prelude to uncovering a responsible apocalypticism that is consistent with the revelation of Jesus crucified and resurrected. Everything we say about God has to take place in the shadow of the cross. Because if it doesn't, that's when some of our apocalyptic thinking, or even our Christian thinking, or even our attempt to be loving really falls short, because we end up with a remainder again. We end up with someone outside. We end up with someone in the weeping and gnashing of teeth. This is the problem sometimes with the parables. In fact, Adam and I were talking about this last week after church a little bit. The problem with these parables is if you turn them into an ideology, meaning they become their own closed system that is to interpret everything, you will always end up with some kind of disappointing loose end. And then in your mind, you just go, well, I hope if there's a chance of 3 people and one of them messes up, I just hope I'm not the one that messes up. I'm the one that wants to enter the master's joy. So I hope that's me. So let's talk about this parable, because it is important that it has to be read in the light of the heart of Jesus. And so we need to do both things together. It's sort of creating a stereoscopic vision of the gospel this morning. But what we have is the story of a master who is distributing some kind of treasure to the servants. And you'll notice that there is no description of what any of them did with the treasure, except the one who buried it in a hole. We have no understanding of how much time has passed. It just says a long time has passed. What we have is an encounter where there is some kind of endowment. The master endows these people with this gift, and then there's some kind of accounting of that with the intention that all the servants are meant to enter the master's joy. So this is that kind of encounter. Like when we baptized Emily, baby Emily, today, and people kept coming out of the church going, oh my gosh, baby Emily is such a beautiful baby. And I go, they never say that when the baby's not. Not that we've had ugly babies, but if we did, no one comes out and goes, oh my gosh, that baby was horrifying to look at. But this is the endowment. Baptism is the time where God endows you with special gifts. And so this is your endowment, where the master comes and says, you are part of my household. You are not even just a servant. You're one of my children, and I want to endow you with my gifts. And none of us knew what our life was going to be like. We had no idea. Think about it. This is the constant recalibrating of our expectations. We all have a fantasy about our life. Well, when I grow up, I'm going to do this and this and this. And very rarely do all those things happen the way we expected. There are paths that become dead ends. There are things that become broken down. There are things that go beyond our wildest dreams, and we go, I would have never expected I would end up here. Like when I was a little boy growing up in southern Arizona on the border of Mexico, I would have never expected to live in Huntington Beach, even though we visited Garden Grove almost every year because my parents had their best friends there. So you don't know where your life is going to bring you. It's just part of, we have the endowment, and we don't know what happens in the interim until this time of accounting begins. But when we hear this parable, oftentimes we subtly think about the talents as our talents. So that we do our own little play on words. Rather than a sum of wealth, we think about, well, what gifts have I received that I can use in God's service? Not a bad idea. But let's just take a moment to consider what Jesus uses in this parable, which is something financial. And if you know, now this is for all the history people. So if you don't like history, you can just check out for about 2 minutes and then come back when the rest of us are through our fun little lesson. If you remember, currency is a technological innovation. Coins, bills, like that didn't always exist. They used to transact business through weights. So you would weigh out silver, you would weigh out gold. And that's why God is always so upset when the people in the temple have unjust scales. Or when we use the phrase, they put their thumb on the scale. Because it means that there isn't a just exchange of whatever they brought for whatever they want to offer God. And so this injustice is very offensive to God. Especially when religious institutions are unjust with the money of God's people, God gets very upset by that. And that's still the same today as it was in the time of the temple. God doesn't like to see economic exploitation of the faithful. But we also have to remember, and I've told you this, that God knows that human beings love money. We love money. We love counting it. We love seeing where it's invested. We love seeing little charts of where it's going. And we love seeing, okay, when this matures, I'll get this and this when I'm retired. And that's good because we know that we can turn that into whatever, a house, a retirement, a boat. But God does not care about money like we do. To God, it doesn't matter. God's like, I don't love money like you do. I love people like you love money. I've told you that before. And so one thing I want you to think about with this parable of the talents is, what if part of the endowment that God is accounting for is just the other people in your life? If God loves money, or if we love money, if God loves people like we love money, then it could very well be that part of this endowment is God has entrusted people to us, and we've been entrusted to others. And you will know if that endowing of relationship and that endowing of human life has gone well or not. You don't need anyone to tell you whether it's gone well or not. You know in yourself whether it's gone well or not. And you know that when you were given to someone and they did not treat you right, you know exactly how that last slave feels when they go out into the dark. You already feel that way. You don't have to go out. You already feel that way. This is part of the human experience. And you know that people who mistreated you, or the way that you were limited in your upbringing, whoever it was, whatever adults or children were shaping you, that oftentimes you might pay forward that same pain because that's all you knew. That's how you were shaped. And so it's interesting to imagine, what if the thing that is valuable to the master are other people? And these could be your own children, these could be your parents, these could be aunts, uncles, neighbors, they could be your best friends, they could be people you met in the military, they could be co-workers. I don't know the people that were endowed to you, but I do know that it's more important to God what happens with those relationships than what you do with your wealth. Unless you misuse your wealth in such a way that it ruins your relationships with other people. God cares about that because of the result. That's when we do talk about the stewardship of wealth. That is an important characteristic, which is, how does this become a tool to enhance prosperous living? God's goal is abundant life. That's what God wants. Now, the interesting thing about this is, the master knows the servants well. So it says, the master gave to each of them what he knew was acceptable to them, or what, he had the sense of who they were, as each was able. So there's the sense that whatever God endows you with is what God knows you should have, in the sense of what your capacity is. And notice that God doesn't compare servant to servant. God just says, I knew who you were, the master, I knew who you were, I gave you what I thought you should have, and that's all I want to talk about. I don't want to talk about other people, I don't want to talk about this and that. It's the very famous Jewish parable where someone goes into heaven and he says to God, I'm so sorry I couldn't be Moses, and I tried really hard to be Moses. And God says to him, well, if I wanted you to be Moses, I would have made you Moses. I wanted you to be Steve. I wanted you to be Adam. I want you to be yourself. Otherwise, why would I have made you? I already had a Moses. He did okay, but I'm going to talk to you about what I gave you and what it is that you're supposed to be doing. So part of this is a recognition that the master is setting up the story so that we can enter the master's joy. This is the master's whole point. Does the master really care about the keeping of accounts? Well, maybe, but we have several parables where the master doesn't. The master is more interested in the relationship, and I think the master is interested in the mutuality of trust, where the master says, I believe in you, I have faith in you, I hope you have faith in me. And this is the covenantal reciprocity. God has faith in us, God hopes that we have faith in God. And you go, well, yeah, that seems easy. Yeah, God has faith in us, we'll have faith in us. And then we get the leftover, or we get the one where it doesn't work. And we get the shocking moment where we go, wait, why isn't this working? It's just supposed to work. Like it appears, you just go out, you come back, and you go, look, it doubled. And the master goes, just like I expected. Until there's this other person who spent the whole time thinking that a mistake had been made. Now, all we know is that the master had been gone, it says, a long time. And so this isn't like, well, I've had a couple days to think about it, and I'm getting used to the idea. This is someone who has nursed this version of reality, this resentment, across what could be a lifetime. Now, you might know what that feels like. If, in fact, you feel that you were given to the wrong family, if, in fact, you feel that you have something that's overwhelming with the people that you're dealing with, you might know exactly what that feels like to spend a long time with a feeling of regret or resentment going, something's not right about this. Now, what are we supposed to do with that? Because it appears that when that person comes and tells the master, I know who you are, I don't have faith in you, I just know you were going to ask for it back, and I'll give you back what was yours, that there is no return of faith, and in fact, all that can be offered is resentment. Or all that can be offered is distrust. What did you expect me to do? I don't know if you've ever felt that about your life. This third person might be the most familiar person in the parable, even though we don't want to admit that, because no, they're the wrong person. No, you want to be one of the good ones. I want to be one of the fives. I want to be one of the twos. I don't want to be the one. But that feeling of alienation, that feeling of resentment and regret may be the most human feeling in the entire story that we're aware of. And then what happens? That person gets kicked out. And this is where the parable can go off the tracks a little bit if you don't read it in the heart of Jesus, which is, we think, okay, well, time to spin the statue again. Go spin the Mary and see what happens. Time for us to do something, which is I need to get my act together, so when I am asked about my talents, I'll know what to say. Rather, we have someone who's kicked out into the darkness. There's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And it would appear that if that's the end of the story, we don't really need a redeemer, because it's just like what was already there, which is some people will get it, some people won't. God gave us a law. Some people seem to be doing okay, some people less so. There's a spectrum of response. How did you do on the test? Oh, I got a C. God's grading on a curve, or whatever it is. We're trying to find some way to make acceptable this reality where some people will always end up on the outside, and they appear to be the ones who are the ones that need the most help, the ones that were given the least, or the people that felt they were given kind of short shrift in life. I didn't ask for these talents, and I didn't ask for the way they treated me, and I didn't ask to be buried in the ground, and I didn't ask for all this stuff, and now what do you want me to do with it? Okay, fine. Punish me and kick me out. In many ways, it's the sociological way that animals deal with sick animals. We kick them out so that they don't threaten us with their illness. It's what happens when people are grieving, a mother and father grieving for their son who died unexpectedly. People don't want to hear about that grief because they are afraid it will be contagious, and they must keep it to themselves. When people express that they've experienced abuse in a relationship or in a home, very often people say, oh, you shouldn't talk about that here. And they go, well, where should I talk about it? I don't know, just not here. It's not polite. So then it gets pushed off to the side. So animals kicking out sick animals, and it's important that we have this animalistic understanding, because the next parable in the story is where God identifies with the least of these. That's the next one. All right, are we still good? I can quit if you want. I'll go just a couple more minutes. Garby, what do you think? 2 minutes? Yeah, 2-3 minutes. It always turns into 5 minutes, but this is probably the most important thing I'm going to say, so I guess I shouldn't cut it off at the end. But the most important part of the story is when you take the intention of the master, and when you put that intention under the shadow of the cross of Jesus, something wonderful happens, which is the master wants you to enter his joy. That's it. The master wants you to enter his joy. This is the whole point of the story, the endowment, the measuring up. I know who you are, and I want you to be with me. And we know that the master in real life, not in some parable, the master in real life told his son that when there were people in the dark, I want you to go out and find them. That's what the master actually did. Not some story. This is the data of the cross. Are there people outside who have nothing? Even that will be taken from them. See, we see that we see that statement of Jesus in the parable as a moment of humiliation. You have nothing, let's take that from you. No, this is Jesus taking the nothingness of our death, the nothingness of our regrets, the nothingness of our uncertainty. The master refused to leave people in the dark, so he himself went to that place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. And just to make it clear, it wasn't just a dark night, it's hell. It's the grave. He did not just come to say, come on everybody, you can do better than that. He came to take all of those people who were dead. He came to take all of those people who were cast off. He came to take all of the people who never really trusted that God loved them in the first place, and he wanted to take them and re-endow them with the invitation, come and enter my joy. And notice he didn't just go to the grave through the cross. He took and broke open the gates of hell so that everyone who is dead, everyone who is separated, could come and experience the joy of Easter. There is now no one who is cast out who will not meet Jesus in their darkness. Nobody. Now, what God does with that, how God deals with that, it's up to God. I know I have a hope, but this is redemption. This is God's judgment. This is God's wrath. You want to know about God's wrath? Watch him hanging on a cross, and he will love you in the midst of your violence. He will love you in the midst of your uncertainty. He will love you in the firm idea that God has gotten it exactly wrong and has to die. And so we will murder him for the sake of our community, for the sake of the public safety, for the sake of the wellness of our religion. We will murder him and make the exact wrong move, and that is where God goes into the darkness to find people like us. So, you better hope you're the third person in that parable, because you're the one he's going to find. And you're the one that he's inviting into your joy. And in case you wonder if that's true, he already told us he would in this baptism. It's a watery rescue. This isn't just water of life, it's water of death. It's like pulling a body out of the water, but in this case, pulling it out of the amniotic sac of Easter and giving it new life. This is the miracle of Christianity. And this is how we can go to the graves of young men who should have grown into old men and preach a word of hope. This is how we can go to the hospital when the baby doesn't make it and preach a word of hope. This is how you can tell people who seem to have nothing in their life but regret and sadness that this isn't where God is going to leave them, because all of us have been called into the Master's joy.